So the tricky thing about trying to figure out how you would do a talk or a book or presentation or anything about the Bible is that it's probably, other than Harry Potter, it's the biggest thing that's ever been sold in terms of a volume, right? Like it's a perennial bestseller. It's perennially gotten attention in all kinds of cultures, and there's probably more books written about the Bible than any other thing that's ever been written. And so, like, even trying to figure out, like, where would you start to think about the Bible is part of the issue. And so what I thought I would do for this first session is to talk just in general about what the Bible is. And then after that, for the rest of these sessions, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go general anymore after that. We'll take specific examples as ways to, like, get into what the Bible is. Because ultimately that's also the most interesting. Like, we could talk at kind of a meta level about what the Bible is, but that could get tiresome too. It's more interesting to say, what's this chapter or what's this book doing, and then does it give us some ideas about things in a more general sense about what's going on in the Bible. So on your handouts that I gave you, what I did today was just to do something really simple to say, perhaps the Bible is at least these things. So let's go with the first one. We act like the Bible is a book because that's how we normally print it, right? We print it in one volume. And we sometimes, even in our culture, because it's printed in one volume, we act like it's a cohesive book, like a novel or some other things that we read that have that kind of cohesion. And the problem with that view of the Bible is, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, although there is some truth to there being continuity in the Bible, that it has an overall kind of trajectory or shape or those kinds of things, it's also true that the Bible is not cohesive, that it's more like a collection. One of my favorite images for how some worshiping communities illustrate this in their actual, like, practice is if you go to a synagogue, for example, the synagogue will have this, like, closet off on the side of the worship space, and inside they've got all these different scrolls stored. And then when they're reading from different parts of especially the first 5 books of the Bible, whenever they're reading from those, what they do is they bring out that scroll, and then they read from that one. So if you're in that worship space, you get a visual illustration of what the Bible is more like. It's more like a library. It's like a collection of books. And probably the majority of the discussions and the debates that have happened, especially since the 19th century, about what the Bible is, have taken place because people came back to a greater awareness of that. And then they started noticing things like, oh, well, then that means that a person or a group of people actually organized this thing. They took this one book and decided to put it up on the top shelf, and they grabbed another book and they said that one should go on the bottom shelf. And sometimes they even took books and cut them up and put them together into new books, right? There's all kinds of things like that are in the Bible. So it's more like a library that somebody has sorted out over time. So just to give you a really simple example of that, like the most obvious example of that might be the Psalms, because the Psalms are each an individual song or poem, and then some group of people had to get together and decide which songs, how many, and then that's going to be our songbook. It's the same way that every hymnal has ever been put together. And the problem with putting together songbooks is the one that everybody always deals with. I remember a long time ago, I can say that it was a long time ago because seminary actually is a long time ago for me now. My worship professor who helped put together the Lutheran Book of Worship, they had 5,000 submissions of hymns from across the church for what should go in the hymnal. And if you print out 5,000 hymns and put them in a stack, it stands about this tall. And then they had to get those 5,000 songs sorted down to, in the LBW, it was about 520 songs. So number one, there were people who, no matter what, there were going to be people who were upset that they didn't get their song in, right? But then there was all this thought that had to go into how many of what type? Should we put, how many Pentecost hymns do we need versus how many Easter or Christmas hymns do we need? And what's the balance between lament and praise and all these kinds of questions? And then what order should we put them in? And what period should they come from? What kinds of themes should they represent? All that kind of stuff. So if you think about the Psalms in that way, rather than thinking of the Psalms as this thing that just kind of magically appeared, oh, boom, here's 150 songs for the church to sing, but rather that there was a group of people that worked together to select from a wider set of songs. And they had all kinds of criterion for this. You know, some of the criterion were authorship. These are songs of David, and David's important, so we're going to keep a lot of David songs in. We still do that today too, right? Like the hymnal has more songs by Luther or Wesley or Bach than it does by other authors because there's the authorship thing. But then there are other reasons why you keep hymns in. A lot of them have to do with popularity. You know, I bet Psalm 23 was the amazing grace of the Psalms. You know, it's the one that we cannot have Psalm 23 in the hymnal, you know. And so you have this kind of communal process for forming the text. And then, even once you've got it narrowed down to 150 songs, you have to ask, what order should they go in? You know, what's going to be first? What's going to be last? What should go right before Psalm 23? Well, Psalm 22, right? And Psalm 22 is really different than Psalm 23. So there's all these kinds of decisions that are made. Again, quite a bit like a library as you're starting to think about how to organize things. Where should we put nonfiction and fiction? Where should we put, how are we going to categorize nonfiction even within that discipline? What is a auto mechanics book? Or should it be shelved compared to some other kind of material? So if you go out to the wider Bible, beyond the Psalms, the same thing held true. So you had these different collections of writings that were written over time, and the span is immense, right? So for example, some of the stuff that's now collected in Genesis, especially in Genesis, is influenced by really, really ancient texts. You know, you have things where it echoes some of the earliest written anything, like the Gilgamesh narrative or other kinds of ancient texts. And then those were woven into like a newer assembly, so that by the time that whoever it was that was working in the faith community to start deciding which books of the Old Testament are going to be the Hebrew Bible, you've got a kind of fairly solid Genesis in place that somebody has worked and put together. And then all the way up to when you're looking at some of the prophets, like especially the short prophets, some of those are very, very late, right up until or even during the Babylonian captivity and some of the exilic period. And then if you're putting together a library, you sometimes have to make decisions about how new should stuff be that's on these shelves. If this is the archives, if this is the historical books section of the library, how new of a book are you allowed to put in? And so then they had to make decisions about, there were some books that had been written by the time of Jesus that the faith community was using, but they considered them too new to put into the Bible. So you get some of that apocryphal or deuterocanonical stuff that's in the middle that is put in kind of a different category. And then they organize it along the way, so they organize it kind of loosely historically, but then there's some stuff that's almost kind of like trans-historical. Like, what are the Proverbs? They're not dated to a specific time. They're kind of supposed to be wisdom for all times. And so you get all these kinds of different things. And then if you walk through the library itself and you look at especially the Old Testament, although there's also ways in which this is true of the New Testament, the types of material that are in the Old Testament are super diverse. So you have the core early books, the Pentateuch, the first 5, which although they're supposed to be telling the basic early story of Israel, actually also include things like legal codes. Like people are bored when they read Leviticus, but if they knew the genre, they would never get bored or frustrated because they would realize that it's the same as if you wanted to sit down and try to read the legal code of the state of Arkansas. You just don't read it with the same expectations. This isn't going to read like Harry Potter. This is going to read like a law book. And it has another purpose. You read it for other reasons and at other times than you would read narrative. Or if you go past those first 5 and that collection, then the next kind of set that you get are what we would call kind of the classically historical books. So you get like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Those come as close as about anything to trying to do real like recorded history in the way that people from that period were writing. But then you get 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles are also history, but they're history the way that a high school textbook writer in a nation with opinions about itself would write it, right? We always talk about how things get portrayed in American history or other nations. How you portray George Washington in a textbook. Some textbooks will be like, yeah, cherry tree, and other textbooks will be like, no way, cherry tree, right? Depending on how historically accurate you're trying to be versus how much you're trying to evoke the spirit of who George Washington was. And so 1st and 2nd Chronicles is one of those books that kind of does that. It rewrites the history again, but does it in this more kind of grandiose and celebratory way. Then you shift into a set of texts kind of in the middle of the Bible that aren't historical at all. I've named a couple of them. You get a songbook. You get a collection of wisdom, the Proverbs. You get a very strange book, Job, which is like the closest thing to a theodicy or trying to talk about why there's evil or suffering in the world that you're ever going to get. And it's a big, long poem. It's like Moby Dick, but in a poem. And then you get Esther, also really strange because God's rarely, if ever, mentioned, but it's in there for another reason because it's celebrating a woman who saved the people of Israel from a despotic regime or person, Haman, right? And then you get Ecclesiastes, which, if you've ever read Proverbs and then immediately jumped into Ecclesiastes, you realize that this is a really weird library because it includes books that even argue with each other. Proverbs has a very strong sense that life has meaning, and if you focus your life well, you'll have success and joy and happiness and many children. And then Ecclesiastes jumps into right away with everything is vanity and a chasing after wind, and kind of undermines everything that was in Proverbs, and they're right next to each other. And then you get the prophets, the vast kind of texts of the prophets. You get some that are real tight and small because they were short little sayings of prophets. So those are like the minor prophets. Then you get these really big, long. Some of the longest books in the Bible are like Jeremiah and Isaiah. And those were even themselves libraries within libraries. Almost no one thinks anymore that Isaiah is a product of one author. It's a collection and assemblage of probably at least 3 different major periods of authorship assembled into this one big Isaiah. And so that's a really kind of big, sweeping way to talk about the Bible as a library. And notice I haven't even talked about the New Testament, which is its own other kind of library, right? And the New Testament adds into the library in this way. It's kind of like if you had a library in town and you had a collection kind of established, and then a bunch of new technology and events came up, so you build a new building and you move the library across town into the new facility, and you add a whole bunch of acquisitions, and you have to make a decision about how to mix the new acquisitions for your library in along with all the older stuff. And so our Bible is weird in that sense that it's taken these newer acquisitions. So in fact, you have a skip. Unless you count the Apocrypha, you have this skip or jump from about, say, at the earliest 3rd century BC texts, you skip like 300 years, and then the earliest text in the New Testament is going to be maybe around 62 AD. So you have this 360-year jump, and now we've decided to add some more texts onto what was already an established canon or library. And again, I don't think we think about this very often, but that's the way the Bible is. It's actually like the New Testament is like an appendix onto what was already functioning just fine for the community. Because in fact, even though the first texts of the New Testament were written in the 60s, nobody decided they were Bible until around 100 to 200 years later. And then the final canon wasn't formed until considerably after those texts were written. So you don't have until, like, say, around 200 or 300 that the final form of the whole Bible is together. And then what's really even more strange about the Bible as a library is then after that, the Bible closed its doors and said, no more acquisitions. We're not taking in any new books. Although there's never been an official declaration that the canon has to be closed, so there's no policy at the library that says we can't take on any more texts. It's just we've become so traditioned with what we have that anyone who tries to convince you that we should add something else usually can't assemble enough convincing evidence that the library should take in an additional thing. There have been people that have attempted to do this over the years. The most recent one was that a number of people were many people were very convinced that perhaps a letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. should be added to the biblical canon, for example, because it's so in keeping with what the New Testament says and does that there could be the possibility that you could argue for that. But tradition has gone along so long, 2,000 years of essentially this is the canon, that it's just really hard to convince a huge community of believers that you would want to add something like that on, or more ancient texts that maybe have some continuity with it. There were some letters, like the letters to Clement, that weren't included in the Bible, and now maybe people think they ought to be, but we just don't tend to do that. So now what we have today, between these covers, is this library of texts that was basically completed by the 2nd century. And we have very few debates anymore about what should be in. Although you'll have people, you've probably seen in the popular media, people who are saying we should let in maybe like some of these Gospels that were excluded, like Thomas or Judas, or that will have discoveries that will challenge a little bit of the content. The most recent discoveries have been the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Dead Sea Scrolls illustrated that perhaps some things we have in Jeremiah should be changed or edited. Maybe maybe there's 151 Psalms instead of 150 Psalms or something. So you have these small things. But the overwhelming thing that we've discovered when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were they just sat in jars for millennia, and then people discovered them in the 60s going up into these caves, is pretty much what we have now, what people have been copying for centuries, is exactly what they had then. So that it actually, rather than it being a challenge that there's some slight differences, the more interesting thing is, over the centuries, we've pretty much copied exactly what was there at the time that the Dead Sea Scrolls were stored away. It's kind of an interesting thing. Before I move on to the next ones, did anybody have any things flash up or questions they wanted to ask about the library one?
I like the metaphor. That really makes a lot of sense to me.
I like it as a metaphor, yeah. I find it to be helpful too. And probably the most helpful thing for our faith in terms of that metaphor is it means when we go to read different parts of the Bible, we don't treat all the Bible the same, but we read it for what we try to. In other words, when you go into the Bible, you should figure out what section of the library you're in, and you shouldn't get confused. If you just shouldn't read laws as if they were novels, and you shouldn't read, different genres incorrectly.
Shouldn't read numbers thinking you're going to get all excited.
That's right. That's right.
Well, it also gives you start at the beginning. I'm going to read the Bible. You don't have to start.
Absolutely. That's right.
And think you're going to read the whole thing through.
That's right.
You can pick it up anywhere you want.
Yep.
Pull out a book.
Unless you really are one of those people who's a completist, where when you go into the bookstore, you're like, I'm going to read all the fantasy novels this bookstore has, and I'm going to start with A. And so that's fine. Go ahead. But yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Challenges me to go back to my chronological Bible and read it.
Yeah. Well, see, then this is the thing that's interesting is there's always been these habits or patterns in the community to try to organize the Bible more than it's organized itself. Either that way, like chronological, or another example would be like the Jefferson Bible, where he wants to make it more humanist, so he cut out all the stuff that he just didn't believe and that wasn't about morals or whatever. I mean, sometimes the library aspect of it makes people feel uncomfortable because of the diversity of what's there. So the next one, an enigma. The reason the Bible's an enigma is because it's really the oldest thing we read. Unless you're a total ancient texts geek and you like to read the Nag Hammadi scrolls or stuff from Hammurabi or some other kinds of ancient things, there's nothing older than the Bible that we read. And the problem with that is almost everything else that we read is completely contemporary. I'd be interested to know, have any of you read anything, raise your hand if you've read anything written more than a century ago, say in the last month. Some people sit around and read Charles Dickens, that'd meet the criterion, right? Or people do, but it's kind of rare, right? I was just holding Beowulf in my hands the other day at the library because J.R. Tolkien, new translation is out, and that's pretty old. That's medieval, but that's not nearly as old as the Bible. That's still a baby. It's still a baby compared to the Bible. And so then the issue for us is our minds are prepared to read contemporary things. We read the newspaper, we read magazines, we read novels, we read nonfiction, whatever we read, we consume, and it's all been produced recently. And so we go to the Bible, we read it, and we expect to be able to understand it as readily as we understand the newspaper or the magazine. But the huge time distance between us and those authors means that there's a bunch of kind of barriers in the way to actually really being able to understand the Bible well. And one of the first rules that oftentimes people express is how you should read the Bible is you should try to understand what's written in the Bible as a contemporary reader of it would have understood it. So as much as possible, try to understand the Gospels the way the first community that received a gospel would have read it. And the tricky thing to do that is that means as a person who didn't live then, who lives now, we have to know some stuff about, say, the sociological context of Palestine in the first century in order to understand the Gospels. And that's not easy. Where are you going to start? Read a couple books on the sociology of Palestine in the first century. That's not a bad start, actually. But you're just going to get your feet wet at that point. And then if you want to read stuff that's even older than the Gospels, if you want to read, say, Genesis, how do you get your head around understanding how the first readers of Genesis would have understood the text? There's the enigma part. There's no way to solve this problem exactly. It's just the fact of the matter. But it's good to keep it in mind. Because if we don't keep it in mind, then we act like somebody wrote Genesis last week. We read Leviticus as if it were written by a senator from Arkansas. And it wasn't. Right? It was written in an era where the just if you just take Leviticus as an example, where there weren't any political structures like we have now, and religious law was, in a sense, civil law. The two overlapped to such a degree that it wasn't really hard, or wasn't very easy to kind of separate or parse them out from each other. And then much more than that. I mean, they had different sensibilities about what you should and shouldn't eat than we do. You know, I drove down College yesterday on the way to the library, and there was a big truck out selling crawfish. And then I came home, and I looked on Facebook, and I saw somebody post a picture, a Christian, eating crawfish, right? And you don't eat crawfish in Leviticus. It's shell, right? So but why? Is it just because it's gross, or is it because, then getting into the kind of the sense of like why those people didn't eat shellfish, that's where the complexity of understanding where Leviticus comes from gets really, that's one reason that it's an enigma. And then another reason that it's an enigma is because we actually, and this will get into the next two things that I have here, it is back up a second here. When Christians say that they try to compare Christian faith to, say, one of our neighbor faiths, like, say, Islam, one of the confusions that we make is we draw a little parallel and we say, oh, okay, the Bible must be like the Quran because they're both books. And then for Muslims, Muhammad must be like Jesus because they're both male humans, right? But that's actually not the right comparison to make. And one problem we have in Christianity today is that oftentimes Christians approach the Bible the way Muslims would. Now, Muslims have their own internal reasons for approaching the Bibles in the way that they do, so I'm not like criticizing the way that they approach their religious texts. But we get confused and we think that the Bible is the Word of God, like the thing handed down from God, directly from God, and then given to us, which is actually what Muslims believe about the Quran, right? Muhammad heard these sayings and started to record them, and everything that's in the Quran was a report of direct sayings from Allah. Our Bible, the Christian Bible or holy text, isn't like that. It's a book written by human beings. We can often identify who the human beings are that wrote it, in which we meet God, or through which we meet God. That's what probably the basic Orthodox Christian way of understanding the Bible is. So the Bible is, on one level, it's just a book, and it's open for us to analyze it the way you would analyze any other kind of literature, right? So if it's fiction, then you read it as fiction. If it's history, you can critique it based on other historical texts that are around. If it's poetry, you can analyze the poetry. It's available for us to kind of like analyze and look at it in the way that any other human text would look at, that we would look at it. But then Christians add a layer, which is to say that in addition to looking at it from a human point of view and reading it or thinking about it in that way, it's also available to us as a book of faith. It's that we believe that when we're reading the Bible, we meet or encounter God or Christ in and through the Bible. That's the enigmatic part, because most books we don't treat that way. Although really, really interestingly, in the modern era, I find this to be a fascinating phenomenon. In the modern era, when everything has secularized to a degree, right? So there are no holy texts anymore. Then what happens is people who are into literature start treating all literature as holy on another level, right? So you'll hear people say in the academy, or people who just really like literature, that say Proust can save your life. You can even read books, How Proust Saved My Life, right? Or you can read books where people talk about how a certain poet really helped them rediscover a sense of the ultimate or the divine or whatever. And so we start to look, in a kind of a flattening sense, we start to look at all literature as potentially available to us for those kinds of senses of the divine. But prior to that kind of secularizing moment, the main place that people looked for to meet God was in this particular book, the Bible. And so if you were to do that chart over again, it wouldn't be Quran to Bible, Muhammad to Jesus, but it would actually be Quran to Jesus, right? So Jesus is the one who actually came in the flesh as God in the way that Quran is the living embodiment of the word of Allah in the world. And then our Bible is the place in and through which we meet Christ. That was Luther's famous phrase, that the Bible is the manger in which Christ was lain. That was his main kind of interpretive way of thinking about what the Bible is. And so in a manger, some of it holds everything up, and some of it is the straw that when the animals spit or poop, you throw it out, right? And so Luther felt completely free to place some parts of the Bible higher or lower than others, because not all of it was so easily the place where you would meet Christ. If Christ wasn't named, or it wasn't very clear that the gospel of Christ was proclaimed in a specific text, then he would relegate it to a lower place. James, Revelation, 2 Corinthians, just because it's so confusing. Like he pushed all those out to the side, then he put more in the center the things he felt you really could meet Christ. Romans, the Gospels, Galatians, and all these kinds of texts. Any questions or reactions to that portion?
Weren't there some parts of the early Bible, like where God spoke to Moses, right? So there might be parts that were similar to.
That's a great, yes, exactly. The closest ones are going to be the prophets themselves, who regularly report in what they write down that God said to them, "Thus says the Lord," and then they'll put it in quotation marks. But they're always careful to delineate what they're saying from what they received from the Lord, right? So in the prophetic works, you get both kinds of texts. Yeah, that's it. Yes. So right, another way to compare the Quran could be to say it's like the "Thus saith the Lord's" of Jeremiah or Micah or something like that. Okay, the last section I won't actually go that long, but I just want to invite us to think about these. I put the most kind of content in this third one because I thought you might want to look it up later and see how it works. This is the most theological thing I'll say today. The difference between the Bible and other kinds of literature that we read, if you're willing to open yourself to this possibility, is that most of the things that we read, we think of ourselves as being this, and we take this or that thing that we read and we incorporate it into us. Like, I find useful news in the newspaper that will help me do my job later this week, or whatever. But you're taking from what's available to you and you're bringing it into you. The Bible is, if you're willing to submit to this, interested in rewriting you into it. That's the way the Bible functions as a literary whole. So now I'm going against the library thing for a bit and saying kind of the opposite. The Bible as a whole, organized as a library, is organized that way to try to incorporate everybody who's reading it or who thinks of themselves as a participant in the community that the Bible is supposed to be centered around, is rewriting that community to incorporate it into this wider thing. This is not a very Western way to think. So this is part of the problem today, is we have trouble with this just conceptually because we think of ourselves as autonomous selves. And to think that we're subject to a larger narrative or story is sometimes hard for us to do in a contemporary era. But yet that's what the Bible is trying to do, is it's trying to rewrite us into it. And it does that both on the grand level and then also on the miniature level. So on the grand level, the way it does that is it functions as our book of faith. So it's the Bible is the book of this community. You'll even, probably a lot of Christians would say, if you were to ask them to define what Christianity is, one of the things that they would say is, it's the community of people that reads this book, right? Or has this book at the center of its life in some way. But then on a miniature level and within the Bible itself, and this is what's fascinating, the Bible keeps telling the story that it already told over again within it. So you get like the creation narrative and the Exodus story and all those kinds of things. And then periodically throughout the Bible, they go back and they tell the story to themselves again in the Bible itself. So first time that this really happens is Moses, before they go into the promised land, stands up, Deuteronomy does this huge speech and tells them where they've been and where they're going. But that was already written down. Now he's saying it again, right? So you get this retelling within the text itself. And then you get that same kind of thing multiple times. So you get like Chronicles retelling the history that's already in the history books. And then on a smaller summary scale, so if you're intimidated by reading Chronicles, don't do that. Don't start there. The first book of Chronicles starts with a 9-chapter genealogy and that kind of thing, so you don't want to. But go to the smaller summary scale ones and see how this works. Like Psalm 78, 105, and 106, they tell the salvation story in miniature. They tell the whole kind of story of Israel. Isaiah 40 through 55 does it. Ezra 9 does it. Nehemiah 9. Daniel 9. Or actually the most readable kind is to go to the book of Acts and just read the early sermons where Peter stands up and says, the people, and then starts telling this long story that ultimately leads up to Christ being the fulfillment of the story that he's telling. And so, if you do actually sit down and read the Bible as a whole, all the way through, you get the big arc, but while you're reading the big arc, you get little spins. You get like mini reviews. It's like in some academic books where after the chapter is done, the author says, now I'm going to tell you again what I told you, right, for 2 pages before you move on to the next. And there's didactic value in that, among other things, right? To really remember stuff, you need to have it repeated to you again. And so it's not just it's not repetitious. It's more like it has pedagogical value. Yes, that's right. And part of the reason that they do that too is because just like the disciples were so stubborn that they couldn't get it even after they'd seen it, Israel had been like that too. So they needed to keep hearing the story over again to be reminded of who they were. There's always been a temptation, the Bible reports, to not think of yourselves as being part of this bigger story. There's always this temptation to write your own story rather than making yourself open to being written into this bigger story. Then, just 2 last things to mention. One, it's there's a book that if you are feeling like having a really big block of a beach read this summer, you might check it out. James Kugel wrote a book a few years ago. He is a Orthodox Jew who teaches Bible at Harvard. And what he does in this book is he illustrates how the early church, up until basically the Reformation, read the Bible with specific texts. And then says, and then along came the 18th and 19th century and historical criticism and all this kind of contemporary way of thinking about the Bible. And now, by and large, we read the Bible this way, using historical critical tools, literary analysis, all this kind of thing. And we see the Bible so differently, depending on whether we read it according to the ancient way or the modern way. This basic thesis, and I buy it, is that it's as if we have one Bible and it's two Bibles. It's like the exact same text, but because we read it so differently, it's like we're seeing completely different things. It's like that picture you see in psychology where you ask whether it's a duck or a rabbit, and it's either a duck or a rabbit, but you can't see it one way or the other at the same time. You can only see one or the other, and that's our contemporary problem. So one of the problems we have, especially as modern readers of the Bible, is we have trouble. We really struggle with reading it this ancient way, which was kind of more the way of faith, being subject to the Bible, versus I've got critical tools that I can lord over the Bible, and I can tell you that, Paul was a misogynist and hated women or whatever. That's one way to read, versus this other faithful way, which would be like a hermeneutics of trust. Like, well, let's try to hear Paul and not immediately assume or use our tools to come at him, and let's first try to be subject to it versus judgmental of it. These are the kind of tensions that are going on. And the problem we have is we've got both of those tool sets in place at the same time, and it's almost like we have a split brain to a certain degree. We really struggle with some parts of the Bible that don't stand up to our tests, and yet we also want to hold the Bible as a book of faith at the same time, and we really struggle to reconcile those. Kugel argues that they're basically irreconcilable. So he basically just lives with a split brain. In the academy at Harvard, he teaches using the critical tools. Saturday morning, he gets up and observes Sabbath and reads the Bible as an Orthodox Jew. And he doesn't see a way to weave them together. He considers them to be basically incommensurable. It's a kind of interesting challenge, but I think it's one we're all dealing with on different levels. Because, and the last point here, we're all wondering whether this is the Word of God. Or we're saying, this is the Word of God. And we wrestle with that. Every Bible study I ever teach anymore, if I sit down with a group of people, I'll have some people who are for sure this is the Word of God and are real confident, have no questions about that. And then I've got other people who are saying things like, I just don't really think we should read the Old Testament anymore because it's too violent. And so they the thing that upsets one of their sensibilities or another, they just decided, then I'm just going to push this away. And that's in Christian community. I'm not even talking about, say, a group of people that might just read the Bible as literature at university or in a bookstore or some other place like that, right? I mean, I'm just talking about the tensions that are happening even within the Christian faith community at people who decide to come to a Bible study on a Wednesday at noon or on Sunday morning or something like that. We have these different ways that we're coming at it. Any final?
I just want to say, too, if you want to read the Bible as a novel, there's an author, Walt Wangren, who wrote the book, The Word of God, that is written just like a novel. And so he tells the stories from, the point of view of people, and it's a really cool way to read some of the stories.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to do that higher education kind of thing, and you just want to read a novel, read the Word of God.
Mm-hmm. How to read the Bible. It's a great title, How to Read the Bible, and then it goes into all, and he illustrates it chapter by chapter with different examples, like how we read the binding of Isaac by Abraham today versus how they read it for the first 1,200 years that they read it. It's completely different. We think it's child abuse. It didn't even occur to anybody that it was child abuse until the Middle Ages. So it's like these completely different ways of reading the same text. Okay, so next week we'll dig right into some specific texts and use those as kind of the launching point for talking more about the Bible.